We're the United States of America, for God's sake. We can take care of both of these and still maintain our overall international defense.
Is the United States ready to support multiple conflicts? As the world order continues to shift, the United States is facing a series of simultaneous conflicts, from Ukraine to Gaza, and increasing aggression from major powers like China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea.
The prospect of having to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously is becoming more real than ever before.
Conflicts and preparing for potential conflicts with Russia and China just requires so many more resources that the United States can no longer afford to use force in the sort of expansive way that it has in the past.
President Biden says we can handle it.
The most powerful nation in the history of the world.
But is that confidence warranted? What are the strains on resources, the diplomatic obstacles, and the potential flashpoints that could push the United States to the brink?
A lot of the challenges and crises we face really come down to political problems that have political solutions, and not military power as the first tool.
Military force, aside from fighting wars, is also a key to preventing wars from ever happening.
I think the United States has to engage the world. I think the basic problem has been how we engage the world by assuming that we have to take on a position of leadership.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, we're joined by Dr. Rafi Cohen, Director of the Strategy and Doctrine Program of RAND Project Air Force, Dr. Jennifer Kavanagh, Senior Fellow in the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Political Scientist at the RAND Corporation, and Professor Simon Reich, Professor of the Division of Global Affairs Political Science at the Rutgers School of Arts and Sciences, Newark. Moderating the discussion is Joanna Głowczewski.
So, Simon, when looking at the current changes in the global system overall, you have written about a fuzzy bifurcation in relations between great powers and other countries, something which you believe is historically different than in previous eras. Could you please elaborate? And also how this impacts the US? Why does the global system matter when it comes to America's ability to support multiple wars?
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here with such distinguished panelists, and looking forward to today's conversation. The essential elements that I think are historically unprecedented is the fact that there's a vibrant debate taking place at the moment. A minority, a small but important minority, wants to argue that, well, actually, we're still in a unipolar moment, that America's strategic advantage in a series of fields is so great that it persists. There is a large group that want to argue that we are in a process of moving towards bipolarity, and the delinking process that we've seen, for instance, economically, is taking us in that direction. And there's a third group particularly coming from the global south, that want to argue that, in fact, we're evolving into a multipolar system. And the reason why I think that all three positions are mistaken are because they're reliant on past historical analogies to discuss a situation that is dynamic and evolving and unprecedented. We call this term fuzzy bifurcation, my colleague Richard Higgett and I, in our project, for the following reasons. Certainly, there is a bifurcation taking place between the United States and China, but it is not bipolarity. Those two countries enjoy strategic advantages in the fields of diplomacy, economics, and the military, and they're the only two great powers that have unmatched capacity in all three fields. But while this bifurcation is taking place, the relationship that we see is quite distinct from, say, bipolarity. In the era of bipolarity during the Cold War, essentially countries were tied to either the United States or the Soviet Union, not only militarily, but also economically. And the fluidity between the two blocs was very limited. In the current context, however, what we see is countries that may be tied to one or each of these powers, say militarily, are not necessarily tied towards them economically. And this leads to an era of diplomatic flux. So if I can use some examples, South Africa, for example, is one of the United States' largest trading partners, but it carried out military exercises with China and Russia as recently as late 2023. ASEAN countries are closely tied militarily towards the United States, but economically towards China. Of course, the best example of this may be India, which is tying closer over time, if somewhat reluctantly, towards the United States as a security partner, but is one of Russia's largest purchasers of oil at the moment. We see, therefore, consistently within the global South, but also even amongst some of the United States' closest military partners, a propensity to demonstrate a variance in behavior. I read a piece last week from Jo Inge Beckevoid in Foreign Policy, in which he said, small countries and medium-sized countries can't have a grand strategy. And I couldn't disagree with him more. I think that when you look at the behavior of these countries, they demonstrate a greater degree of strategic autonomy because China and the United States are both heavily involved in charm offensives, both in the global North and the global South. But there's tremendous variance. The United States fell down, for example, on COVID vaccine distributions, and that's led to a resilient hostility towards the United States in areas of the global South. We see areas where there's obviously flux, and in the context of that dynamic flux, countries are taking advantage of the capacity to pick and choose between the two sides. In some, those relationships are fuzzy, hence the term fuzzy bifurcation and how they come together.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And now I'll turn over to get a look at the military perspective to you, Rafi. You know, over your career, you've focused on U.S. defense strategy and military planning. How have the threats evolved over the past decade, and how is the U.S. responding to them? Are there any historical parallels in regards to the scope and number of threats?
Great. Well, thanks, Joanna, for the question, and thank you to Network 2020 for inviting me to speak today. I want to talk a little bit about, take what Simon sort of laid out and sort of in the grand IR series lens and sort of translate that over into how defense planners think about the world and how particularly they build military capabilities, both the numbers of platforms and troops, and the types of capabilities you need into, based on that perceived threat. And specifically, I want to talk a little bit about the force sizing construct. The force sizing construct is DoD lingo, Department of Defense lingo, for just how much security is enough. How many troops do you need? How many planes do you need? How many ships do you need? What kind of capabilities you have? And I think it's helpful here, since you referenced history, to go a little bit back in time and sort of talk a little bit about how that's changed over time. Ever since World War II, really, the United States is worried about fighting two wars simultaneously. That's during World War II, we had the European theater, but we also had the Pacific theater. Both of those played out roughly simultaneously. Now, during the Cold War, we were primarily focused on defeating one adversary, the Soviet Union, but we also had some sort of idea of fighting multiple wars simultaneously. The concern was that the Soviets would go pouring through the Fulda Gap in Germany and conquer Western Europe, but simultaneously the United States was kept on fighting wars in the Pacific, in Korea, Vietnam, and the like. Now, in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, the United States also kept up with this sort of two-war construct here. And they did so primarily to solve an analytical problem. With the end of the Soviet Union, sort of defense plans were casting around like, well, how much security do I need? Because we don't really know what the adversary is. And what they settled on was, well, we need to be able to deal with Iraq under Saddam Hussein and North Korea under Kim Jong-un simultaneously, and that's why they kept it up. And more or less that construct held up until the Obama administration, when thanks largely to a increasingly powerful China, it became particularly evident to planners that, dealing with a really certain China is going to eat up increasingly numbers of resources. And so if you look at the national defense strategies of both the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and most recently the Biden administration, all of them have sort of said, well, we're going to fight and win one war and have enough troops and capability to do one war. And then we'll do something else about other places. We'll deter, we'll use our allies, we'll use nuclear weapons. What that is sort of left a little bit vague. The problem with all of that is what we saw beginning in February 2022 with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. With that, there's a prospect of fighting a big war in Europe. We're fighting a proxy war right now. We have a potential fight in the Pacific with China over Taiwan or other scenarios. And now we have a problem with the Middle East as well, thanks to the Gaza war, but also, I think, more broadly, Iran and its proxies. And what's most troubling, and here we'll sort of leave off of that, is that we're seeing our adversaries sort of collude together to ever greater extent. We see a no-limits friendship between China and Russia, but also weaponry being passed from North Korea and Iran to Russia. Hamas delegations go up to Russia as well. So our adversaries are going increasingly intertwined. And so what defense planners are struggling with is the prospect of having to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously is becoming more real than ever before. And that's, I think, where the challenge that the United States faces today.
Great. Thank you so much. And then Jennifer, you also have a military point of view. Yours is just a little different. You write about how the U.S. should not rely solely on the use of force to influence or resolve international crises, which historically has been America's primary method of response. Why do you believe that it's no longer effective, and what other tools should the U.S. be employing?
Well, first, like my co-panelists, I want to thank Joanna and Courtney for inviting me to be on this panel today with such great co-panelists. I think I would start by saying I wouldn't say that the use of force has become less effective or is no longer effective. I think I would argue that military force has always had a very narrow set of cases in which it can achieve U.S. objectives. And those tend to be cases where the United States is able and willing to commit enough resources to radically shift the balance of power on the ground. And when that occurs, and when the military aims at military goals that are narrow and discrete, it can be effective. I think what's changed is the willingness of U.S. policymakers to use force in ways that extend outside of this narrow set of use cases where it can be effective. Their willingness to take on multiple of these obligations at once, and the margin of error that they have for doing so. So if we think back to the early 20th century, the U.S. tended to use military force in very narrow ways. Things like defend very specific economic interests or companies or embassies, and so tended to be very effective in its use of force because it was pursuing very specific military goals. After World War II, the U.S. came out as a leading world power, very big military, and having experienced the experience of World War II led the United States to really double down on its use of military power to protect a whole range of economic and other interests. Because the military has historically been the most well-funded of the pieces of the U.S. government, has become the default option, something that policymakers turn to first because it is the most responsive, it is the quickest, it is the easiest to call up in a crisis. And so military power has become the go-to tool. And this was only reinforced after the end of the Cold War when the U.S. had no real adversaries. It was very easy for the United States to take on a whole range of different military commitments. And it had a wide margin of error for doing so because it could overextend itself without real concern about about its vulnerabilities being taken advantage of by adversaries. I think after 9/11 and the 9/11 wars, that sort of narrative, that approach has crashed back down to reality, which is the United States, as Rafi described, faces a number of increasingly powerful peer or near peer adversaries, as well as the tendency of our adversaries to work together in certain ways. And so that margin of error is essentially gone. And conflicts and preparing for potential conflicts with Russia and China just requires so many more resources that the United States can no longer afford to use force in the sort of expansive way that it has in the past, and needs to make much more careful choices. So I'm not arguing that military power should never be used. In fact, it is necessary. I think the war in Ukraine has demonstrated how important it is that you have military power to use to protect your core national security interests. But it should be limited to those core interests. So I think policymakers need a very narrow definition of what those core interests are, and a really careful set of criteria for when you meet that bar to use force. Military force should aim at military goals, and we should aim for things to be discrete and short, with a limited number of forces. My research suggests that the worst outcomes tend to come from the large, long interventions. That doesn't mean you should never do them. It means you should be very careful about making that type of commitment. What other tools should you use then when these criteria aren't met? A lot of the challenges and crises we face really come down to political problems that have political solutions, where we should be leaning much more heavily on diplomacy, and not military power as the first tool. I think the Middle East is a good example. There's obviously a security dimension, so you can't completely rule out the use of force, but at its core, the problems in the Middle East are political problems and need political solutions. So I would tend to push much heavier for better funding of diplomacy and a focus on political solutions. Economic solutions as well. In Asia, the United States has, under the Biden administration, has really doubled down on its investment in its security architecture in the region, but has no real effective economic policy at all. That is not a recipe for having influence in the region or building resilience in our allies and partners. So leaning on those economic tools, whether it's trade, which has sort of fallen out of favor, or economic investment, or other types of economic engagement, are increasingly important. I think the current world makes our allies and partners much more important. We need to be doing more burden sharing and burden shifting. They have to take on a greater share of their own defense and their own security. And then the final option I would put out there is to do nothing. I guess I would push back on this idea that the United States is the essential nation that has to be involved in all crises around the world. In fact, my research with colleagues at RAND, when I was there, suggests that in a lot of cases when the US does nothing, the outcomes tend to be very similar to comparable cases when the US did intervene in terms of length of conflict, likelihood of recurrence, and US interests. So the do nothing option shouldn't be written off. There are cases in which doing nothing is the best choice for pursuing and protecting US interests.
Great, thank you so much. Rafi, did you want to comment on anything?
I did, actually. And, you know, I largely agree with a lot of what Jennifer said, but I'd like to sort of maybe broaden the aperture a little bit, because I think that there's two things here I think that's important, is that, you know, we tend to talk about, you know, different tools in the foreign policy toolkit as either diplomacy or military force or economics. The truth of the matter is foreign policy is actually made with a combination of these tools. And, you know, even if there's the question of fighting wars, but military force and military power gives you leverage, frankly, that you don't have absent that. And it allows diplomacy to work. I mean, this was Secretary Mattis's big statement when he was both at CENTCOM and then as Secretary of Defense. And you can see this play out particularly in the Middle East here too. When the United States left the Middle East, it left a giant sucking chest wound, which a whole bunch of nefarious actors filled. That's not good for the United States. And the point is, for a relatively small commitment of forces, you can shape dynamics and enable diplomacy to work. And then the other part here is that military force, aside from fighting wars, is also a key to preventing wars from ever happening, for deterrence here. So, you know, And I know Jennifer, has written about this, so she's well suited to talk to it. But the point of military force ideally is not simply to win wars, but it's also to prevent wars from happening. And you can do that if you show credible commitment to back up commitments with military power if need be. And that's something that I don't think we should understate at all.
I could just respond to that quickly.
Sure.
I know that we're going to get to the Middle East later, but I would push back a little bit on this idea that the U.S. left the Middle East. Before October 7th, there were 45,000 U.S. troops deployed to the Middle East. That doesn't really look like leaving the Middle East to me. I recognize that we pulled down U.S. presence, but I would push back a little bit on that. The reason I think that's important is I agree with Rafi 100% that military power can help to deter conflicts, and that requires forward presence. But at such high levels, which I would consider 45,000 to be a lot of troops, and out of sync with the U.S. interests in the region, at such high levels, they become a liability because any crisis that happens in the region implicates the United States, and the risk of the United States getting pulled back in as it has now is extremely high.
So I disagree with that, Jennifer, for a couple of reasons. First off, the absolute numbers don't matter as much as how the region perceives it. John's all about perceptions of both our adversaries and our allies. So it could be 45,000, it could be 60,000. If the Iranians views you as on the way out, and more importantly, as say the Saudis or the Israelis or any of the other actors do, and they did, having talked to them, that's going to engender a whole bunch of negative second-order consequences, even if you are right that the absolute numbers still show the numbers up there. Anyway.
Thank you. Thank you. And then, so yes, Simon, please jump in, and then I have a question for you.
Sure. I think, it's a very interesting discussion between Jennifer and Rafi, but I think that basically what they're toying with is the question of the form and the degree of engagement and what it means to be an essential power. I read Essential Power and I thought, oh, we're back to Madeleine Albright's indispensability, and that requires American leadership, et cetera, et cetera. And again, I defer, or I should say, I demur by saying I think that part of the problem, not just in the Middle East, but more generally, has been the form rather than the degree of American engagement. I'm not a fan of retrenchment in the Middle East or anywhere else. I think the United States has to engage the world. I think the basic problem has been how we engage the world by assuming that we have to take on a position of leadership. In my own work, I'm working on this notion about, well, what would an American grand strategy which focused more on the implementation of international law look like? In terms of, your audience would be, I suspect, shocked to discover that the international treaties to which we're not a member, UNCLOS, okay, that's, the United Nations Law of the Sea, we're not a member, and that's very inconvenient for us in places like the South China Sea. But we're also not a member of conventions. We've never ratified conventions on the rights of the child, on the rights of people with disabilities. The list goes on and on. The audience would be shocked to know the amount that hasn't been ratified. And in the context of thinking about American strategy more broadly, which seems to be my role on this panel, I would like to contemplate, well, if we had taken counterfactually a different position on, say, at the outset of the Israeli conflict, not that we shouldn't have supported Israel in the way that Biden suggested it, but should have focused more on the implementation of international laws from the outset, we might be in a slightly different diplomatic position today. So I agree with Jennifer with the focus when she stresses the focus on diplomacy. But the question is, well, what form does that diplomacy take? Again, I could come up with numerous examples that we could work on, which would demonstrate, outside the more topical and heated issue of the Middle East, like the South China Sea, like the Ukraine war, et cetera, et cetera. But I can see everybody, I've prompted a response, so I'll wait for the response with great interest.
Well, I guess my role on the panel is to fully support the president's idea that we are the essential power. I think we're the essential power for a host of different reasons across the globe. The reason being is if you look at Europe, all the various European powers have capability there. There is no framework country here for a variety of reasons. Germany would have the natural lead based on economic weight for obvious reasons of history. They're not particularly keen on leading in the military front. Britain has always been sort of, on the fence of which side of the Atlantic it belongs on. We can go down the list here. We provide that sort of basic leadership there too. It's also true in the Indo-Pacific here as well, where, between Japan and South Korea, there's a lot of blood between them. The sort of common framework country is the United States. It's also true on the military level as well here, because the United States has military capabilities that, frankly, none of these countries have. Bombers, tankers, large combating commands that can organize all these military capabilities and go forth. I mean, it'd be nice if we weren't the essential power. It would be certainly very convenient. There's certainly people in the foreign policy world who would like it. We are. Now, as for the diplomacy on the Middle East, this is one of my favorite pet bugaboos. And I just have I'll flag the foreign policy article that I wrote. Maybe Brian can put it in the chat. But I think there's a lot of it's very easy to say, well, it would be nice to have a diplomatic solution. When we begin to think concretely about what that means, it becomes a whole lot more difficult to implement than I think we give it credit for. And it's really easy for us to show, here's how military power goes awry, and it does go awry in plenty of different ways. But it's not clear that there's this sort of magical wand that we can wave of diplomatic power and then crises go away. It's just not.
At Network 2020, we believe that diverse perspectives hold the power to transform our understanding of global challenges. By connecting professionals across industries and borders, we facilitate informed discussions that shed light on the complex issues that shape our future. Our community is built on the belief that knowledge sharing and collaboration can spark innovative solutions. Join us to engage with thought leaders, explore new ideas, and expand your network. Learn more at network2020.org.
Simon, going further with your conversation about the fuzzy bifurcation, turning to Europe, a traditional area of American interest, what are the strategies that our allies there are using in their relations with China and Russia, and how do they differ from that of the US?
I am so torn because Brian and Jennifer's comments are so interesting, and I would love to get back, but I shall dutifully focus on the question. But if there's time, I want to come back to it, please. So I mentioned this concept of fuzzy bifurcation, and I can understand why your audience might find it a little fuzzy. So as an illustration of what I'm talking about, let's focus on the Europeans for a moment. Rafi is quite correct when it comes to talking about military strategy and the need of the Europeans to bandwagon on the basis of this, and America being essential to them. The question is what essential means, and that's what I'd like to come back to at some point. But the United States is certainly essential militarily. The Europeans announced yesterday, that they're going to have a further initiative of basically an industrial policy for military production. But, my concern is that they're still 2 years into the war, sleepwalking to a large extent. Where it becomes more nuanced and perhaps more interesting, and certainly I suspect more interesting for some people in the audience, is when we move away from the military and we look at other spheres. Because then what you see is this fuzziness taking effect. So, for example, if you look at areas such as trade or, in fact, climate change, in markedly different ways, Richard and I in our work, and I noticed that you put a couple of links in the chat. Thank you. But Richard and I in our work look at trade and look at climate change. And these are areas where the Europeans, and when I say the Europeans, I want specifically to focus on the European Union itself, as an actor, has really hedged in terms of its strategy between the United States and China. Over climate change, for example, they went back and forth from the Americans under Obama to the Chinese under Trump, and now a little bit tilting back towards the United States under Biden, but they're really adopting a hedging strategy. This is why notions like bipolarity don't work for me. More interesting, perhaps, is when you look at technology policy in key aspects such as digitalization on the one hand or artificial intelligence on the other, the Europeans are really striking out on their own. This is an area that, to use their common term of strategic autonomy. So what we see when we look at the Europeans are arguably our closest military allies because of NATO, is a tremendous variance in behavior, which has enormous implications for the United States. The Europeans are developing their own ecology when it comes to digitalization. They focus far more on privacy and consumer rights than we do, and your audience sees it every day when they get on a European website and, you know, you have the button to reject all the cookies, as opposed to in the United States where you can do that, but you really have to search to find, to figure out, and I'm sure that I do it wrong half of the time. So in the European context, arguably the most crucial case in terms of alliances, the United States really has to work very hard on issues like trade. Jennifer mentioned trade in Asia, and the IPEF, the initiative of the Biden administration, is essentially going nowhere. The Europeans have had very little luck coming up with a free trade agreement with the Americans as well. So the Americans have a big fight on their hands in dealing with this, whether it's the Biden administration, and it'll be even more complex if there's a second Trump administration. We see enormous variance in the way in which countries behave. And we are going to have to cope with that. And we're going to have to come up with some new mechanisms as well as some new ideas. So we have to figure out, coming back to Rafi's point, where we are essential and, unfortunately, where we are not. And where we are not essential, we're going to have to fight a lot harder to get that kind of support in order to have the leverage effect that we want.
Right. So a place that we might have to fight harder, Rafi, is what would happen, for example, we currently have what's going on in Ukraine and Gaza. If there would be hostilities breaking out between China and Taiwan, how would we adapt to that crisis?
Yeah, well, thanks, Joanna. And let me I'll agree with Simon on his latter point. There are areas that we are less essential. Military, I don't think it's less of a question, but certainly in some of these other arenas, we are. But in answer to your question, Joanna, I think you hear this argument a lot, particularly from a wing of the Republican Party, about why not to back Ukraine aid. The idea being that there's a specific trade-off between we give money to Ukraine and therefore we are less prepared for a war against China over Taiwan, for instance. And I think that argument is wrong strategically for four big reasons, and I want to sort of highlight all of them. First, it's important to know that both the wars in Europe in Ukraine, but also the war in Gaza, are being conducted largely without American casualties. There were a handful of American casualties, unfortunately, intervening to try to raid some of the Iranian weapons shipments to the Houthis, but largely these are not consuming large amounts of American lives. And that's sort of a difference. Second, when you look at the types of equipment that particularly the Ukrainians need, and the types of equipment that you would need in a war against Taiwan, there are noticeable differences based on geography. Europe is primarily a land theater, so you need weapons like tanks, artillery, and the like. By contrast, if you're operating in the Indo-Pacific, just by the nature of geography, you need a lot of attack submarines, a lot of very advanced fighter aircraft, a lot of very advanced bombers, and the like. Now, there's some areas of overlap, most notably capabilities like air defenses, where I think there's tension there, but between the two-seaters or between the three-seaters, really. But nonetheless, I think there's, to a certain degree, that they are distinct based on the nature of all of these different conflicts. The third point I would make is, and this is one where, I'll cite some of the work coming out of the American Enterprise Institute, which is a right-leaning think tank trying to message to those, that element of the Republican Party who's holding up Ukraine aid, is that a lot of Ukraine aid goes into strengthening the American defense industrial base, and building out warm supply lines, so you can produce more munitions, for instance. Basically, what happened during the Cold War, similar to what happened in a lot of different other industries, we moved into sort of just-in-time logistics, and we'll buy just enough. What we're finding out in Ukraine in particular is that wars require lots and lots of fairly basic material like munitions, tanks, so forth. And so by investing in Ukraine aid, you're actually expanding that defense industrial base, and that actually will be useful in the short term for fighting in Ukraine, but also in the long term, should the United States ever find itself in a war against China. And the fourth and final point I would make on this score, it's important to realize that, I think our adversaries are looking at one another. And one of the best ways to prevent a conflict from happening is that the Chinese look over what's happening to their friends who know no limit friendship, and see that their ill-fated territorial conquest is decisively defeated, and raise ultimate questions about whether or not this is such a wise move to do in elsewhere. And so I think you get that added deterrent effect. I mean, the deterrent effect is not just about military capabilities. After all, it's ultimately about will. So for all of those reasons, that's, I think, how you should be thinking about preparing for other future contingencies.
Simon, if you don't mind, I could just move on first to Jennifer. Returning to the Middle East, what do you think the Biden administration's approach has been to the conflict? What recommendations would you make? Would you offer to de-escalate? And is there a risk of kicking the can down the road?
Yeah, so I need to respond to a couple of Rafi's points, but I will try to weave them into my answer to this question to compress the time. I don't think it's possible to look at the Biden administration's response since October 7th to see it as anything but a pretty significant failure. And I say that, up front, that the October 7th was a horrific event, and Israel has a right to self-defense. And I am supportive of the United States' efforts to provide aid to Israel. But I think that the way the United States has gone about it has led to a number of problems. So I'll just lay out what I think those problems are. And I know that Rafi is going to disagree with me. So I will look forward to hearing his views on this issue. So the first thing I'll say is that it's gotten the United States more involved in a region that it was trying to move away from. The Biden administration came into office with the idea that it was going to focus on China and try to remove itself from conflicts in the Middle East and remove itself from dealing so heavily with Russia. And it's done exactly the opposite. Now the new strategy is to try to de-escalate with China so that we can spend more time focused on the Middle East and Russia. In my view, that's a mistake. The U.S. has much more significant strategic interests in Asia than it does in the Middle East, or really in continuing to bleed out Russia and Ukraine. So I think that the Biden administration's response, though, led naturally to this. It was almost an immediate rush of U.S. forces into the theater on top of the high number that were already there. Massive amounts of unconditional military aid to send to Israel, where there was no real plan for what was going to happen in Gaza. Defeating or eliminating Hamas completely was never an achievable goal. So it just represented a repeat of the Ukraine problem, which is providing large amounts of military aid to a partner or an ally that doesn't have a really good military strategy or plan for what's going to come next. As I said before, I view the problems in the Middle East as largely political problems. I'm not saying you can't deal with military force. I agree with Rafi that diplomacy and military force have to go hand in hand. But the political angle, the political aspect here just hasn't really gotten the attention that it deserved. The U.S. goal when it went to the Middle East was to try to de-escalate and avoid a spillover across the region, and the opposite has happened. There's increasing tension between Israel and Lebanon on Israel's northern border, and you have the Houthis shooting missiles into the Red Sea and causing not just disruption to global commerce, but also and now an environmental catastrophe with this, or potential environmental catastrophe with the sinking of ships that are carrying fertilizer and other types of toxic chemicals. Meanwhile, you're expending large amounts of U.S. military assets. So, the strikes that the U.S. is conducting on the Houthis and the Houthi targets in Yemen use large amounts of long-range fires, especially ones like Tomahawks, which are basically the most useful in an Indo-Pacific scenario because of their range and capabilities. One round of strikes against Houthi targets uses up an entire year's worth of production of those missiles, which are no longer available. Rafi mentioned the air defense with Ukraine. Air defense is a huge need in the Indo-Pacific, and we currently have 8 Patriot battalions or batteries stationed in the Middle East that could be deployed to the Pacific. In fact, they were supposed to be deployed to the Pacific, but they are now in the Middle East. So again, no longer available for a Pacific contingency. Meanwhile, the situation in Gaza has gotten even worse. You have a security nightmare, humanitarian disaster, over 30,000 people dead, most of them women and civilians. So I just really struggle to see how this policy has been a success. It's contributed to U.S. overstretch and use of key U.S. capabilities. And there doesn't seem to be a political or path forward really from any of the parties. The Biden administration's proposal, which is this Saudi-Israeli normalization deal, seems like only worsening the problem. It's not clearly addressing the Palestinian issue and signing the U.S. up for another security commitment that it doesn't have the resources to meet. So in terms of what I would recommend, I recognize that like an immediate ceasefire is an unrealistic proposal because there are security considerations, and you do have to make sure that the security considerations of both sides are met. And stopping in the middle of an operation in sort of a limbo stage is probably just setting up the next round of the conflict. But I do think there has to be a lot greater focus on the political solution and what that looks like and sort of how we get there. And the last thing I'll say, which just builds off this defense industrial base piece, which is this idea that our aid to like the money in these supplementals to Ukraine or to Israel goes to building up the U.S. defense industrial base is sort of true. But the important thing to note is that that happens after we've already incurred this enormous debt by sending lots of equipment abroad. And it happens over like a long period of time. So even if the investment happens today, that payoff doesn't come for 5-10 years. So there's this gap, and you have to recognize then that creates a vulnerability for the United States, in which it's very vulnerable to adversaries and doesn't have either the weapons or the defense industrial base to defend itself. And so I think that that's a really important point, along with the point of what the constraints that workforce limitations create. The defense industrial base can only expand if we have enough workers to fill the jobs. And it's not clear that the United States does have that workforce, which means that you could end up sending the weapons abroad and you have the money, but you can't actually expend the defense industrial base in the way that you had planned.
All right, thank you very much. Now, if I could just turn quickly, Simon, there's a question here that I addressed to you. The questioner would like you to comment on whether the U.S. support of multiple conflicts affects domestic international perceptions and effectiveness of U.S. promotion of democracy, good governance, and genuine peace building.
Yes.
So what is the perception?
And clearly, I mentioned at the outset the charm offensive, which the United States and China are currently involved in. And the United States is losing that part of the war, that part of the conflict. The United States, I mentioned the example of COVID vaccinations and the lack of distribution to the global south as simply one example. But we have had a succession of problems because we are accused by what's broadly defined as the global south. I'm not very comfortable with the term because I think it's a lot more heterogeneous than the term captures, but we have a credibility problem. And one of the elements that we talk about, we talk about diplomacy, we talk about economics, we talk about material factors, but there are let's call non-material factors like legitimacy and credibility that we need to bring to our position. And dating back even to the context of the Obama administration, so it's a bipartisan point, we have not done very well in terms of the way in which we send the message. We have over-militarized our grand strategy in this country for dating back for the last several presidencies. There's no exemption on that point. And so as a result of this, we are treated with deep suspicion. One of my colleagues has been in India doing research, for example, on Indian attitudes towards the Americans when it comes to security partnership, And there is a hesitancy, an abiding suspicion of the United States, which dates back to events over the course of the last 50 years, which makes them very hesitant. So, the formulation of the Quad, for example, into a NATO-style agreement, it will not go ahead if the Indians have a say in that matter, precisely because they say, well, we don't believe in American credibility. One of the interesting things, which is apropos something that Jennifer talked about, was one of the attitudes that became abundantly clear was when the Americans do things like abandon the Afghans in a hurry, or when the United States decides all of a sudden it's going to withdraw from the Middle East, this has an enormous effect on the credibility of the United States, because these countries say we cannot rely on the United States as a security partner. If the Indians are going to be attacked, for example, by the Chinese, they do not necessarily believe that the United States will come to their aid and assistance. And if they will, how long will it last? And so in that context, I think that when it comes to both security allies vis-a-vis NATO and the worry of NATO members about what will happen if former President Trump is reelected, whether it comes to our partners in the Indo-Pacific, and certainly when it comes to our partners in the Middle East, there is a problem. We don't have time and I don't want to be indulgent, but Jennifer's, the question I would have for Jennifer, if I may, she doesn't have to answer, is what would the counterfactual have looked like if the Biden administration had not pursued these policies? And I have my own issues with the policies, so I'm not rah-rah in favor of it. But if the Biden administration had taken a retrenchment approach, what would the world have looked like today? And I suspect, talking to colleagues in Israel, for example, that it would have provoked a sense of escalation that would result in a more widespread conflict on its northern border with Hezbollah by now. So, where I think the panelists differ, if I may, is what the word essential means and how it is defined. If I can vote for another panel where we debate that, please, I would like to do so.
Great. Thank you so much. But Jennifer, if you would like to weigh in on what Simon just mentioned.
Yeah, sure. So I'm definitely not suggesting that the Biden administration should have done nothing after October 7th or should have just sat on its hands. And I, as I said, am supportive of providing security assistance to partners, especially when they are pursuing their legitimate right to self-defense. I think that if I had been asked to give advice, I might have suggested structuring that aid slightly differently. I probably would have recommended less of an unconditional approach and something that put limits on what was provided. In fact, I wrote an article published in War on the Rocks that suggested limiting the provision of long-range strike capabilities and certain other capabilities. I think that it would have an impact on escalation, but also because, in my view, those are the capabilities most needed in the Pacific. And, my view is that those should be safeguarded for what would be a much greater threat to U.S. interests. So that's one example. But I think there could have been other types of discussions that happened beforehand, as well as trying to get a better, military strategy and political strategy in place ahead of time, so that we weren't now, however many months into this with still no real clear end military goal or political strategy. And the U.S. maybe could have facilitated some of those discussions. I think it's ultimately a responsibility within the region, but I think the U.S. could have pursued some of those. So I'm not suggesting retrenchment in the sense that the U.S. stays home and does nothing. I'm suggesting maybe, as I think, Simon, you're correct that maybe we disagree on what's essential, and I'm suggesting a much higher bar for what's essential and a much more stringent use of a much greater more focus on making the hard choices, deciding what not to do, which I think the U.S. is very bad at, and setting clear limits and sticking to them, which is another thing the U.S. doesn't always do.
Great, thank you. Now, Rafi, I think you wanted to jump in on this.
Oh, yes, thanks. So let me respond to Jennifer's comments, because I think, unsurprisingly, I think we may just differ on a couple of these. First off, look, if last three administrations, Trump, and then before him, Obama, all wanted to leave the Middle East and all get sucked back into fighting in the Middle East, despite their best interests, maybe it is because our strategy and what people who write strategy say on paper is not actually American strategy. It's a shown preference. We, the United States, view ourselves as having multiple interests across the range of globe, and we need to account for that. Second, I disagree with the point about that we've provided quote unquote significant aid. We've provided some aid to Israel. It's notably not the long-range strike that Jennifer referred to. The long-range strike, the Tomahawks, we're not providing Tomahawks to the Israelis. We're choosing to use Tomahawks to go after Houthis. Now, we can go after Houthis a variety of other means, right? We can fly aircraft over them. We can make that choice there, but that's just an operational choice. We can sort of debate that. We're not actually giving those to the Israelis. The idea that the Biden approach caused Hezbollah to intervene, or that's just wrong. I mean, bluntly.
Wait, that's not what I said. I just said that the U.S. has not contained the spillover.
Okay, so if anything, having talked to the Israeli planners here, had it not been for American deterrence here, they would be pushing into southern Lebanon as we speak. I can tell you this, I've interviewed them and they've talked to me about this. They basically credit the Biden approach of, all that show of force to we can keep it down to a manageable level here. I have plenty of critiques about Israeli strategy, critiques of the Biden administration, and I find it somewhat odd that I'm now in a place of defending the Biden administration in many respects. But nonetheless, they played that one right, and they probably prevented a much larger and frankly more bloodier war there too. Just the dynamics of that military balance there. And I think that all goes to show here is that, we like to think about strategy as a whole bunch of different billiard balls that we could sort of rearrange as we see fit. Biden didn't go into this, nor did Trump, nor frankly did Obama back in the day, nor did Bush for that matter, Bush 43, with the idea of what I want to get up in the morning is go into a large-scale ground war in the Middle East. No one does that. But that's the strategic circumstance. We don't get to control the nature of the threat, and we don't get to control, and to a certain extent, we don't control American national interests. The American public does. And frankly, we voted multiple times for this policy that we should resource it. And then the last point I would make here about the defense industrial base here, you're right, there's a manpower shortage on key munitions bit. The way you fix that is thanks to the free market. You throw money at it, people will take those jobs. And we could talk about immigration policy here too. That's a separate topic. Probably should have think about making sure that we have the workforce we need, but that's not an insolvable constraint. We have 330 million people in this country. We have the manpower to build a bunch of 155 house.
Well, thank you so much. That's a great note to end this discussion on. It has been just fascinating, and I really appreciate everyone's participation and involvement in the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. Voiceover host and editor for this episode is Casey Craig, with research and coordinating by Anthony Sipe and Brian Dong. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, visit us at network2020.org. See you next time.